I watched my brother Marcus cuff his hands behind his back as Detective Sarah Chen read him his Miranda rights, her voice steady and professional despite the tears streaming down his face. The same face that had begged me just yesterday to put in a good word with his girlfriend about his little business ventures. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Marcus's eyes found mine across the crowded warehouse, wild with betrayal and desperation. Maya! He screamed over the chaos of federal agents cataloging his drug operation. Maya, you have to tell them. Tell them Sarah's lying. Tell them you don't know anything. I smiled and took a sip of my coffee, watching from my safe distance behind the police tape. If only he knew how much I actually did know. How I'd spent 3 months carefully nurturing his relationship with Detective Chen. How I'd suggested all the romantic dinner spots where she could wear a wire. How I'd even helped him pick out the engagement ring he'd planned to give her next week. In my previous life, Marcus had destroyed everything I loved. This time, I'd made sure he destroyed himself. The irony was beautiful. The brother who had spent 26 years treating me like garbage was now in love with the very person who would bring down his empire. And he had no idea that his beloved little sister, the one he'd tormented, stolen from, and ultimately killed, had orchestrated every moment of it. 3 months ago, I died choking on my own blood in a hospital bed, my body ravaged by the drugs Marcus had forced me to test for his operation. 3 months ago, I'd woken up in my 18-year-old body with all my memories intact, lying in my childhood bedroom with a second chance I never thought I'd get. Today, watching federal agents drag my brother away in handcuffs while his undercover cop girlfriend avoided eye contact, I finally understood what justice felt like. The memory of dying never left me, not even after 3 months of living in this strange second chance at life. I remembered everything, the way the experimental drugs had burned through my veins, how Marcus had stood over my hospital bed promising he'd make it right, while secretly planning to disappear with his profits, leaving me to die alone. I remembered the taste of blood in my mouth and the sound of my own labored breathing as my organs shut down one by one. But more than the dying, I remembered the 26 years that led to it. Marcus had been the golden child from the moment he could walk. 3 years older than me, effortlessly charming, blessed with our father's dark hair and easy smile. While I struggled with thick glasses and social anxiety, Marcus glided through life collecting friends, girlfriends, and opportunities like trophies. Our parents worshipped him. Teachers loved him. Everyone saw potential in Marcus, everyone except me. I'd learned early that my brother's charm was a weapon, and I was his favorite target. When I was 7 and he was 10, he convinced me to climb onto the garage roof by telling me our cat was stuck up there. There was no cat. I fell and broke my wrist, and Marcus had tearfully explained to our parents how I'd been acting weird and climbed up there despite his warnings not to. I was grounded for a month for dangerous behavior. When I was 12, I'd won the school science fair with a project on plant genetics. I'd worked on it for months, staying up late every night, growing different varieties of beans under controlled conditions. The night before the fair, Marcus had accidentally knocked over all my plants while playing with his friends in the garage. I'd presented wilted stems and empty pots to the judges, while Marcus's last-minute volcano project took 3rd place. Our parents comforted me by saying at least Marcus placed. At 16, I'd saved every penny from my part-time job to buy a used car so I could drive to my job at the library. The morning I was supposed to pick it up, Marcus had tearfully confessed to our parents that he'd gotten his girlfriend pregnant and needed money to do the right thing. My car fund became Marcus's crisis fund. The pregnancy turned out to be false, but Marcus kept the money for emotional damages. I rode the bus for 2 more years. The pattern never changed. Marcus would create a crisis, I would sacrifice something to help solve it, and then Marcus would find a way to make my sacrifice meaningless while positioning himself as the victim or hero. Our parents saw his pattern of behavior as learning from mistakes and growing into responsibility. They saw my frustrated reactions as jealousy and spite. By the time I turned 18, the first time, I'd learned to expect nothing from my family except disappointment. I'd gotten a full scholarship to study biochemistry at the state university, planning to escape and build a life where Marcus couldn't touch me. I should have known he'd find a way to ruin even that. The summer before my freshman year, Marcus had gotten involved with some business partners who needed someone with chemistry knowledge to help with product development. He'd convinced our parents that I was the perfect person to help him with his pharmaceutical startup during my gap year. They'd pressured me to defer my scholarship for a year to help my brother achieve his dreams. The pharmaceutical startup was a methamphetamine operation. For 6 years, Marcus had used my education and my desperation for family approval to turn me into his personal drug chemist. He'd started small, asking me to just look at some chemical compounds and explain what they did. Then he'd needed me to just test some purity levels. Then he'd needed me to just make a few improvements to the formula. By the time I realized what I'd become, Marcus had made sure I was too complicit to escape. He had recordings of me explaining chemical processes, photos of me handling equipment, documentation of my involvement that would have destroyed any chance of a normal life if it ever came to light. When I'd tried to quit, he'd reminded me that prison was full of people who couldn't handle the family business. But Marcus wasn't content with just trapping me in his operation. He'd systematically destroyed every other aspect of my life, too. When I'd started dating a fellow chemistry student named David, Marcus had planted drugs in David's backpack and called in an anonymous tip. David had been expelled and arrested, his life ruined, and never knew why. When I'd made friends with my lab partner, Julia, Marcus had spread rumors about me selling drugs to students, and Julia had cut contact to protect her reputation. Every time I'd tried to build something separate from Marcus, he'd found a way to tear it down while maintaining plausible deniability. He was protecting the family business, he'd say. He was looking out for me. He was making sure I didn't get involved with the wrong people who might exploit my talents. The worst part was how he'd convinced our parents that he was my protector. When I'd become increasingly isolated and depressed, they'd praised Marcus for keeping an eye on me and making sure I didn't get into trouble. When I'd lost weight and developed insomnia from the stress of living a double life, they'd thanked Marcus for giving me purpose and keeping me busy. The final betrayal had come during what Marcus called quality testing. He'd been developing a new product line and needed someone to test the effects and dosages. Just small amounts, he'd promised, just to make sure it's safe. He'd assured me that he'd tested it on himself first, that he'd never ask me to do anything dangerous. He'd lied. The compound had been designed to be addictive and lethal in surprisingly small doses. Marcus had never tested it on himself. He'd used me as his lab rat because he'd known that if something went wrong, my death would be written off as a drug addict's overdose, not a murder. Our parents would grieve their lost daughter, and Marcus would comfort them while taking over the operation completely. Free from the one person who knew enough to expose him. I'd spent 3 weeks in the hospital, my body shutting down system by system, while Marcus played the devoted brother, holding my hand and whispering promises he never intended to keep. He'd told our parents I'd been experimenting with drugs behind his back. He'd told the doctors I'd been struggling with addiction. He'd rewritten the story of my poisoning into a tragic tale of his troubled sister's self-destruction, and everyone had believed him. I died alone, knowing that Marcus would face no consequences for my murder, that he'd inherit my life insurance policy, that he'd probably use my death as a cautionary tale to recruit his next victim. But then I'd woken up. The morning I'd woken up, in my 18-year-old body had been disorienting beyond description. I'd opened my eyes expecting to see the hospital ceiling, or perhaps nothing at all, and instead found myself staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck to my childhood bedroom ceiling when I was 13. My body felt wrong. Too young, too healthy, too alive. My mind felt crystal clear for the first time in years. For a moment, I'd wondered if the near-death experience had been a vivid hallucination. But when I'd looked at the calendar on my nightstand, the date had confirmed my impossible reality. I was 8 years in the past, given a second chance I'd never thought possible. The first few days had been dedicated to testing the limits of my situation. My memories of the future were completely intact. I remembered which stocks would crash, which celebrities would be involved in scandals, which sports teams would win championships. I remembered every conversation I'd had with Marcus, every manipulation, every betrayal. More importantly, I remembered exactly how his drug operation had functioned and who had been involved. But I'd also discovered that not everything was exactly the same as my first timeline. Small details were different. Conversations happened a day earlier or later, people wore different clothes. Minor events shifted in insignificant ways. The butterfly effect was real, and I'd need to be careful about how much I changed if I wanted to ensure my revenge stayed on track. My first major decision had been about college. This time, I'd known better than to defer my scholarship. When Marcus had approached our parents about my helping with his startup, I'd already accepted my admission and gotten a part-time job that would require me to move to campus early. I'd framed it as being so excited to start my education that our parents couldn't object without seeming unsupportive. Marcus had been furious, but he'd hidden it well. "That's great, Maya," he'd said with his perfect fake smile. "I'm so proud of you for prioritizing your future." I'd smiled back just as falsely. "Thanks, Marcus. I learned from watching you that it's important to think ahead." What I'd really learned was that Marcus needed me more than I'd realized the first time around. Without my chemistry knowledge, his operation had struggled significantly. I'd watched from a distance as he'd tried to recruit other chemists, but none of them had been desperate enough to get involved with his obviously illegal activities, and none of them had been naive enough to trust his explanations about pharmaceutical development. By my sophomore year, Marcus's drug business had been failing. He'd made increasingly desperate attempts to convince me to take breaks from school to help him, offering me money, promising partnership, even suggesting he could get me internships with his contacts in the pharmaceutical industry. Each time, I'd politely declined while gathering more information about his operation. The beautiful thing about having lived through Marcus's rise to power once before was that I knew all his weaknesses. I knew which suppliers would eventually betray him, which partners would steal from him, which law enforcement techniques would ultimately bring him down, and more importantly, I knew exactly when and how the police had started investigating him in my original timeline. In my previous life, Marcus had been arrested when I was 24, 2 years before he'd killed me. He'd served 3 years in federal prison for drug trafficking and had come out more bitter and dangerous than before. His prison connections had helped him build the larger operation that had eventually required my involvement as his chemist. Without me, he'd never reached that level of success. But that didn't mean he wouldn't hurt other people trying. I'd decided that simply avoiding Marcus wasn't enough. He needed to be stopped permanently, and I was the only person with the knowledge to do it effectively. The plan had started to form during my junior year when I'd learned that Detective Sarah Chen was being transferred to the narcotics division. In my original timeline, Detective Chen had been the lead investigator on Marcus's case. She was brilliant, thorough, and completely incorruptible. She was also exactly Marcus's type, petite, dark-haired, with an intensity that he found irresistible. The idea had been so perfect, I'd almost laughed out loud when it occurred to me. Getting Marcus and Detective Chen together had required more subtlety than I'd anticipated. I couldn't simply introduce them. That would have been suspicious and potentially dangerous for the detective. Instead, I'd had to engineer a series of seemingly coincidental meetings that would allow their relationship to develop naturally while ensuring that Detective Chen would be in position to investigate Marcus when the time was right. The first step had been research. I'd spent months learning everything I could about Detective Chen's habits, interests, and schedule. She volunteered at an animal shelter on weekends, attended a book club on Tuesday evenings, and had lunch at the same Vietnamese restaurant every Thursday. She was single, dedicated to her work, and, according to my careful observation, attracted to confident men with dark hair and easy smiles. Marcus, unfortunately, fit that description perfectly. I'd started by becoming a regular at Detective Chen's favorite restaurant. Not to interact with her, that would have been too obvious, but to establish myself as a familiar face in her environment. After a few weeks, I'd struck up casual conversations with the staff about local events and activities. That's how I'd learned about the monthly salsa dancing classes at the community center, which Detective Chen attended sporadically, and Marcus had always been a good dancer. In high school, he'd taken ballroom dancing lessons to impress girls, and he'd genuinely enjoyed it. When I'd suggested that we take a brother-sister salsa class together as a way to reconnect. After my years away at college, he'd agreed immediately. He'd been trying to rebuild our relationship, still hoping to eventually convince me to help with his business. The first class, where both Marcus and Detective Chen were present, I'd made sure to arrive early and save seats in the back row. When Detective Chen had walked in looking for a place to sit, I'd enthusiastically waved her over, introducing myself and Marcus as sibling dance partners who were just learning together for fun. Detective Chen, who was going by Sarah to maintain her cover, had been polite but reserved. Marcus, however, had been immediately smitten. I'd watched him turn on his full charm offensive. The shy smile, the self-deprecating humor, the genuine interest in whatever she was saying. It was the same routine I'd seen him use 100 times, but Detective Chen had seemed genuinely charmed by it. Over the course of several dance classes, I'd carefully facilitated their interactions. I'd suggested partner rotations that put them together, mentioned activities that Sarah might enjoy, and shared just enough personal information about Marcus to make him seem interesting without revealing anything dangerous. The breakthrough had come when Marcus had casually mentioned that he was between jobs and considering starting his own business. Sarah had mentioned that she worked in law enforcement administration and might know people who could offer advice about small business regulations. I'd immediately suggested they grab coffee to discuss it, positioning myself as the supportive sister who just wanted to see her brother succeed. That coffee date had turned into dinner. Dinner had turned into a weekend hiking trip. Within a month, Marcus had been completely infatuated, and Sarah had been playing her role perfectly, expressing interest in his business ideas and encouraging him to share his plans with her. What Marcus didn't know was that every conversation they'd had was being recorded. What Sarah didn't know was that I'd been carefully steering those conversations toward topics that would give her the evidence she needed to build a federal case. The tricky part had been getting Marcus to reveal enough information to incriminate himself without putting Sarah in immediate danger. I'd needed him to trust her completely, and that had meant gradually escalating their relationship from casual dating to serious commitment. I'd helped with that too. I'd encouraged Marcus to be vulnerable with Sarah, sharing stories about his difficult childhood, carefully edited to make him seem sympathetic rather than manipulative. I'd suggested romantic gestures that would appeal to her personality. I'd even helped him plan surprise dates at locations where Sarah could easily coordinate surveillance with her team. The most challenging moment had come when Marcus had started talking about introducing Sarah to his business partners. I'd known that once she met his suppliers and distributors, her cover would become exponentially more dangerous. Federal agents could maintain surveillance from a distance. But if Sarah was expected to participate in drug transactions, the operation could go wrong in a dozen different ways. That's when I'd suggested the engagement. "She's the one, isn't she?" I'd asked Marcus one evening when he'd been particularly smitten after a romantic dinner with Sarah. "I can see it in the way you look at her." Marcus had blushed like a teenager. "Do you think she feels the same way?" "Are you kidding? She's crazy about you." "But Marcus," I'd paused dramatically, as if wrestling with a difficult truth. "If you're serious about her, you need to be completely honest. About everything. She's the kind of woman who values trust above all else, and if she finds out you've been hiding things from her, she'll never forgive you." It had been the perfect manipulation, appealing to Marcus's genuine feelings for Sarah while giving him permission to reveal information that would destroy him. He'd been so grateful for my insight into his girlfriend's personality that he'd immediately started planning both his proposal and his full confession. I'd helped him pick out the ring, a simple platinum band with a modest diamond that suited Sarah's practical personality. I'd suggested he propose somewhere meaningful to both of them, the hiking trail where they'd had their first weekend trip together. And I'd recommended that he combine the proposal with a complete revelation of his business activities, framing it as proof of his commitment to their future together. "She'll appreciate your honesty," I'd assured him. "And once you're engaged, you can start including her in your business decisions. She's smart, Marcus. She could probably help you make the whole operation more efficient and profitable." Marcus had loved the idea of Sarah as his partner in every sense. He'd spent weeks planning the perfect proposal speech, one that would reveal his drug operation in the most romantic way possible. He'd practiced with me, explaining how he'd built his business from nothing, how profitable it had become, how much more successful he could be with Sarah's support. I'd listened with fascination as my brother had planned his own downfall, never suspecting that his beloved sister was orchestrating every word. The proposal had taken place on a Saturday morning in October, exactly 3 months after Marcus and Sarah had started dating. I'd driven them to the trailhead, playing the role of supportive sister who wanted to capture their special moment on camera. What I'd actually been doing was ensuring that Sarah's surveillance team knew exactly when and where Marcus would be making his full confession. Marcus had been nervous but excited, his pocket heavy with the engagement ring and his heart full of plans for their future together. Sarah had seemed genuinely happy, though I'd caught her checking her phone more frequently than usual, coordinating with her team, I'd assumed. They'd hiked to the scenic overlook where they'd watched their first sunrise together. Marcus had gotten down on one knee as planned, presenting the ring and launching into his carefully rehearsed speech about love, commitment, and shared future. Sarah, you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. I want to share everything with you, my dreams, my fears, my ambitions. I want to build something amazing together, and I want to start by being completely honest about who I am and what I do. From my hiding spot behind a cluster of trees, I'd watched Sarah's face as Marcus had begun revealing the details of his drug operation. She'd maintained her cover perfectly, expressing surprise and concern in all the right moments, while subtly encouraging him to provide more specific information. Marcus, this sounds dangerous. Are you sure it's worth the risk? I know it seems scary, but I've been so careful. I have suppliers who provide the raw materials, a network of distributors who handle sales, and I've developed proprietary formulas that are much safer than what's available on the street. It's not like what you see in movies, Sarah. It's a legitimate business model operating in an illegitimate market. He'd gone on to describe his entire operation: names, locations, distribution networks, profit margins, future expansion plans. He'd offered to show her his facilities, introduce her to his partners, and teach her the chemistry involved in production. He'd painted a picture of a criminal empire that Sarah could help him transform into something even more profitable and sophisticated. Sarah had accepted his proposal with tears in her eyes that might have been real. She'd agreed to tour his operation and meet his associates. She'd promised to help him take his business to the next level. What she'd actually done was provide federal prosecutors with enough recorded evidence to charge Marcus with trafficking, distribution, conspiracy, and a dozen other felonies that would put him away for decades. The raid had been scheduled for the following Friday, giving Sarah's team time to coordinate with federal agencies and ensure they could arrest Marcus's entire network simultaneously. I'd spent that week watching Marcus float through his daily routine, blissfully unaware that his new fiancée was documenting every aspect of his criminal enterprise. He'd introduced Sarah to his suppliers, his distributors, and his production facilities. He'd shown her his financial records, his inventory, and his expansion plans. He'd treated her like a beloved partner while she'd systematically gathered the evidence that would destroy him. The beautiful irony was that Marcus had never been happier. He'd finally found someone who appreciated his ambition, understood his vision, and supported his goals. He'd been planning their wedding, their honeymoon, their future together. He'd talked about legitimizing his business eventually, maybe moving into pharmaceutical consulting or chemical research. He'd imagined a life where he could use his profits to create something respectable and lasting. For the first time since I'd known him, Marcus had been genuinely hopeful about the future. I'd almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I'd remembered the taste of blood in my mouth as I'd died from his poison, and my sympathy had evaporated entirely. The morning of the raid, I'd positioned myself at a coffee shop across from Marcus's warehouse, ostensibly studying for my graduate school entrance exams. I'd wanted to see his face when he realized what was happening. I'd wanted to watch his world collapse in real time. Sarah had arrived at the warehouse at 7 a.m. as planned, wearing the wire that would capture Marcus's final incriminating statements. At 7:15, federal agents had surrounded the building. At 7:30, they'd burst through every entrance simultaneously, arresting Marcus and his entire operation, while Sarah had stepped back and revealed her true identity. The look on Marcus's face had been everything I'd hoped for: confusion, betrayal, and finally, devastating understanding. He'd looked around the warehouse full of federal agents and realized that every conversation he'd had with Sarah had been recorded. Every location he'd shown her had been mapped. Every person he'd introduced her to had been identified and arrested. But the moment that had given me the most satisfaction was when his eyes had found mine across the police tape, when he'd screamed my name and begged me to tell everyone that Sarah was lying, because that's when I'd smiled and let him see the truth in my eyes, that I'd known exactly who Sarah was from the beginning, that I'd orchestrated their entire relationship, that his beloved little sister had been the architect of his destruction. Marcus had been led away in handcuffs, still screaming my name, still unable to understand how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. Sarah had glanced in my direction once, a brief look of curiosity about the young woman who'd been so helpful in facilitating her investigation, but she'd had no idea of my true role in bringing down Marcus's empire. I'd packed up my study materials and driven home, officially free from my brother's influence for the first time in my life. The aftermath had been everything I'd hoped for and more. Marcus had been charged with 17 federal crimes, including drug trafficking, conspiracy, money laundering, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. With Sarah's recorded evidence and the physical proof seized during the raid, prosecutors had offered him a plea deal of 25 years in federal prison. Without the deal, he'd been facing life imprisonment. Marcus had tried to fight the charges initially, hiring expensive lawyers with money from his criminal profits and insisting that he'd been entrapped by an undercover officer who'd manipulated him into revealing information. His legal team had argued that Sarah had exploited his emotional vulnerability, that she'd initiated conversations about his business activities, that she'd encouraged him to expand his operation specifically to gather evidence. The argument might have had merit if Marcus had been an innocent person seduced into criminal behavior. Unfortunately for him, prosecutors had been able to demonstrate that his drug operation had been active for 3 years before he'd met Sarah, that he'd committed numerous felonies independent of their relationship, and that Sarah's investigation had simply documented existing criminal behavior rather than creating it. More damaging to his defense, Marcus's own recorded words had revealed the full scope of his operation. He'd bragged about his profits, detailed his distribution network, and described crimes going back years. He'd painted himself as the mastermind of a sophisticated criminal enterprise, not as a victim of police entrapment. The trial had lasted 6 weeks. I'd attended every day, sitting in the back row of the courtroom and watching Marcus's defense crumble piece by piece. Sarah had testified with professional detachment, describing her investigation methods and playing excerpts from her recordings. Marcus had looked increasingly desperate as the evidence mounted, his charming facade finally cracking under the weight of his own recorded confessions. The most devastating moment had come when prosecutors had played Marcus's proposal speech in its entirety. The jury had listened in stunned silence as Marcus had professed his love for Sarah while simultaneously describing how he'd built a drug empire that had poisoned countless people in our community. His words had revealed someone so narcissistic and self-absorbed that he genuinely believed a law enforcement officer would abandon her career and principles to become his criminal partner. When the recording had ended, several jury members had been visibly disgusted. Marcus had finally understood that his charm offensive wouldn't work on people who'd heard him describe his crimes in loving detail. The verdict had been guilty on all counts. Marcus had been sentenced to 30 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. At 29 years old, he'd be nearly 60 when he was released, assuming he survived his incarceration. His assets had been seized under federal forfeiture laws, leaving him with nothing but legal debts and the reputation as a convicted drug trafficker. Our parents had been devastated, of course. They'd attended every day of the trial, unable to reconcile the son they'd worshipped with the criminal he'd proven himself to be. They'd mortgaged their house to pay for his legal defense, only to watch him be convicted anyway. They'd aged years in the span of months, their golden child revealed as a monster who'd been operating under their roof without their knowledge. The most painful part for them had been learning about the extent of Marcus's manipulation and abuse. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors had presented evidence about his pattern of behavior, including testimony from David, my former boyfriend whose life Marcus had destroyed with planted drugs. They documented Marcus's systematic isolation and control of potential threats, his use of family relationships to exploit victims, his complete lack of remorse for the harm he'd caused. For the first time, our parents had been forced to confront the possibility that their perfect son had been a predator who'd used their love and support as weapons against his victims. They'd tried to maintain their belief in Marcus's innocence for as long as possible, visiting him in federal detention and insisting that he'd been framed or manipulated. But Marcus's own words, recorded in his conversations with Sarah, had made denial impossible. They'd heard him describe his crimes with pride, discuss his victims with contempt, and plan future illegal activities with enthusiasm. Eventually, they'd stopped visiting. Meanwhile, I'd been accepted to graduate school with a full scholarship and a research assistantship. I'd been studying chemistry again, but this time for legitimate purposes, working on developing new medications for treating addiction. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was using the same knowledge Marcus had exploited to help people recover from the kind of drugs he'd been selling. I'd also been seeing a therapist working through the complex trauma of my previous life and the moral implications of my revenge. Dr. Martinez had specialized in treating victims of family abuse, and she'd helped me understand that my actions had been about seeking justice rather than simple vengeance. "You stopped a dangerous criminal from continuing to hurt people," she'd reminded me during one of our sessions. "The fact that he was your brother doesn't change the necessity of what you did." I'd struggled with guilt about manipulating Sarah, who'd been an innocent party in my plan for revenge. But Dr. Martinez had pointed out that Sarah had been doing her job as a law enforcement officer, investigating genuine criminal activity. I hadn't created false evidence or coerced anyone into committing crimes. I'd simply provided information that had allowed justice to be served more efficiently. "Your brother made his own choices," Dr. Martinez had said. "He chose to commit crimes. He chose to reveal those crimes to someone he thought he could trust. And he chose to involve other people in his illegal activities. You didn't make those choices for him." The therapy had helped, but the real healing had come from seeing the positive impact of Marcus's removal from society. David had been able to get his conviction overturned when prosecutors had revealed that Marcus had planted the drugs that had ruined his academic career. Julia, my former lab partner, had reached out to apologize for believing Marcus's lies about me and to reconnect as a friend. Several of Marcus's other victims had come forward during the trial, sharing stories of how he'd manipulated and exploited them over the years. Most importantly, the community had been protected from Marcus's escalating criminal behavior. Federal investigators had determined that Marcus had been in the early stages of expanding his operation significantly, planning to recruit additional chemists and increase his production capacity. Without intervention, he would have become a major drug trafficker responsible for widespread addiction and death. I'd prevented all of that by ensuring his arrest before he could grow his empire further. 2 years after Marcus's conviction, I was defending my master's thesis in biochemistry and preparing to start a doctoral program in pharmacology. My research focused on developing new treatments for opioid addiction, work that had attracted attention from major pharmaceutical companies and federal research grants. I'd also been dating someone new, Dr. James Kim, a fellow graduate student who was studying criminology, with a focus on organized crime. We'd met at an interdisciplinary conference about drug policy, where I'd presented research on addiction treatment, and he'd discussed law enforcement strategies for disrupting drug networks. James had no idea about my connection to Marcus's case. As far as he knew, I was simply a dedicated researcher whose interest in addiction treatment stemmed from academic curiosity. I'd been careful not to reveal my personal history, both to protect my privacy and to avoid any potential conflicts with his research. But our relationship had made me think seriously about the long-term implications of what I'd done. James often talked about the ethical complexities of undercover police work, the psychological toll of deception, and the moral ambiguity of using personal relationships as law enforcement tools. Listening to him discuss these issues had forced me to confront uncomfortable questions about my own actions. Had I been justified in manipulating Marcus and Sarah? Had my desire for revenge motivated me more than my concern for public safety? Had I considered the potential consequences for innocent people who might have been caught in the crossfire of my plan? The questions had become more pressing when I'd learned that Sarah had left the police force after Marcus's trial. According to newspaper reports, she'd requested a transfer to a desk job and had eventually resigned entirely, citing personal reasons for her career change. James had mentioned that undercover work often resulted in burnout, that officers who spent months living false identities often struggled with distinguishing between their authentic selves and their cover personas. I'd wondered if Sarah had been genuinely affected by her relationship with Marcus. despite knowing it was an assignment. Had she felt guilt about deceiving someone who had genuinely loved her? Had she questioned her own emotions during their relationship? Had my manipulation caused her psychological harm that I hadn't anticipated? The guilt had been manageable as long as I'd focused on Marcus's crimes and the people he'd hurt. But thinking about Sarah had made me realize that my revenge had potentially damaged an innocent person who'd been trying to do her job and serve her community. That's when I'd decided to reach out to her. I'd found Sarah working as a private investigator specializing in corporate fraud cases. She'd started her own firm and had built a reputation for thorough, ethical work. According to her website, she'd focused on helping businesses identify internal theft, financial crimes, and regulatory violations. I'd hired her. Using a fake name and a case involving suspected embezzlement at a fictional company, I'd arranged to meet with Sarah at her office. I'd wanted to see how she was doing, to assess whether my actions had caused lasting damage, and to understand her perspective on the Marcus investigation. Sarah had seemed professional and confident during our meeting, showing no obvious signs of trauma or distress. She'd discussed her investigative methods with competence and enthusiasm, demonstrating that she'd successfully transitioned from law enforcement to private investigation. But when I'd asked casual questions about her background in police work, I'd noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. She'd become more guarded, her answers more carefully constructed. When I'd mentioned that I'd followed some high-profile drug cases in the news, including that case where an undercover officer took down a whole trafficking network, Sarah had visibly tensed. "That kind of work takes a toll," she'd said quietly. "There are aspects of undercover investigation that people don't understand unless they've experienced them personally." I'd wanted to ask more questions, to understand what she meant, but I'd been afraid of revealing too much about my own involvement. Instead, I'd thanked her for her time and left her office with more questions than answers about the impact of my actions. That evening, I'd called Dr. Martinez and scheduled an emergency therapy session. "I think I need to tell someone the truth," I'd said when she'd asked what was troubling me. "What truth specifically?" Dr. Martinez had asked. "About what I did to Marcus, about how I planned everything, about Sarah." Dr. Martinez had been quiet for a long moment. "Are you feeling guilty about seeking justice, or are you feeling guilty about the methods you used?" "I don't know," I'd admitted. "Maybe both. I achieved what I wanted. Marcus is in prison. He can't hurt anyone else, and I'm free from his abuse. But I'm not sure the cost was worth it." "What cost are you referring to?" "Sarah's career, her emotional well-being, the fact that I manipulated her into falling for someone who was using her, even though she was also using him. I turned her into a weapon without her knowledge or consent." Dr. Martinez had nodded thoughtfully. "Those are important concerns, but I think you're also forgetting something crucial. Sarah is a trained law enforcement officer who chose to work undercover operations. She understood the risks and ethical complexities of her job. You didn't force her to take that assignment or to use deceptive tactics. But I manipulated the situation to ensure she'd be successful in ways she never could have been without my help." "Yes, you did. And as a result, a dangerous criminal was arrested before he could cause more harm. Sarah succeeded in her mission to protect the community, even if she didn't understand all the factors that contributed to her success." The conversation had helped clarify my thoughts, but it hadn't resolved my feelings entirely. I'd realized that my guilt wasn't really about whether my actions had been justified. They clearly had been. Marcus had been a dangerous criminal who'd needed to be stopped, and I'd been the only person with the knowledge and motivation to ensure his arrest. My guilt was about the fact that I'd enjoyed it. I'd enjoyed watching Marcus fall into my trap. I'd enjoyed seeing his confident facade crumble when he'd realized what was happening. I'd enjoyed knowing that he'd been completely outmaneuvered by the sister he'd spent years underestimating and abusing. Most of all, I'd enjoyed the look on his face when he'd understood that I'd been the architect of his destruction. That enjoyment felt dangerous to me, like a part of myself that I needed to keep carefully controlled. I'd been a victim of Marcus's abuse, and my actions had been necessary for my survival and safety. But the satisfaction I'd felt in orchestrating his downfall had revealed a capacity for manipulation and strategic thinking that could easily be turned toward darker purposes. I'd needed to make sure I used those abilities constructively rather than destructively. 5 years after Marcus's arrest, I'd completed my doctoral dissertation on novel approaches to addiction treatment and had been offered a position at the National Institute on Drug Abuse. My research had contributed to the development of new medications that were helping thousands of people recover from opioid addiction, work that felt like a meaningful way to channel my knowledge of chemistry and my understanding of drug related harm. And James and I had gotten married the previous summer in a small ceremony attended by close friends and family. He'd finished his own doctoral program and had been hired by the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, where he'd studied criminal psychology and helped develop profiles of drug trafficking organizations. Our work had created an interesting dynamic in our relationship. I'd focused on treating the medical consequences of drug abuse, while he'd focused on understanding and preventing the criminal behavior that created those consequences. We'd often collaborated on research projects that explored the intersection between public health and law enforcement approaches to drug policy. James still didn't know about my connection to Marcus's case, though I'd come close to telling him several times. I'd trusted him with every other aspect of my personal history, and keeping this secret had created a small but persistent barrier between us. I'd known that he would understand and support my actions, but I'd also been afraid that revealing my past would change how he saw me. The decision to finally tell him had come when he'd been assigned to review cold cases involving family-based criminal enterprises. One of the cases on his list had been Marcus's organization, which federal investigators were studying to understand how family dynamics had enabled and sustained criminal behavior. It's fascinating how this guy's sister completely disappeared from his life right before his arrest, James had mentioned one evening while reviewing case files. She was involved in his early criminal activities as his chemist, but then she went to college and cut all contact. The weird thing is, she was instrumental in facilitating his relationship with the undercover officer who ultimately brought him down. But she seemed to have no idea that her brother was still involved in drug trafficking. I'd looked up from my own research, my heart racing. What do you mean she facilitated the relationship? According to the case files, she introduced her brother to the undercover officer at dance classes and actively encouraged their relationship. She helped him plan romantic dates, gave him advice about proposing, even helped him pick out an engagement ring. But when investigators interviewed her after the arrest, she claimed she had no knowledge of his criminal activities and was completely shocked by the revelations. James had shaken his head in amazement. Either she was incredibly naive, or she was playing a much deeper game than anyone realized. The timing is just too convenient. She distances herself from her brother's operation right before it gets shut down, but she's also directly responsible for putting him in contact with the person who arrests him. I'd felt a mixture of pride and anxiety at hearing James's analysis. He'd seen through my carefully constructed cover story immediately, recognizing the strategic thinking behind my actions even without knowing my true motivations. "What do you think really happened?" I'd asked carefully. "Honestly, I think she knew exactly what she was doing. I think she figured out that her brother was involved in something illegal, realized she couldn't stop him directly, and found a way to ensure he got caught without implicating herself. It's actually pretty brilliant from a strategic perspective." James had paused, looking thoughtful. The question is whether she knew Detective Chen was an undercover officer, or if she just got lucky that her brother fell for someone who happened to be investigating him. "Does it matter?" I'd asked. "Ethically? Maybe. If she unknowingly helped a police investigation, that's one thing. If she deliberately manipulated both her brother and an undercover officer to achieve her own agenda, that raises more complex questions about vigilante justice and the use of deception in law enforcement." I'd realized that this was my opportunity to tell James the truth. He'd already figured out most of what had happened, and his analysis suggested that he wouldn't judge me harshly for my actions. More importantly, I'd trusted him enough to share my life with him, and that trust needed to include the most significant decision I'd ever made. "James," I'd said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you about that case." He'd looked up from his files, immediately recognizing the seriousness in my tone. "What about it?" "The sister you're analyzing, her name is Maya Chen. I mean, it was Maya Thompson, but I took your name when we got married." James had stared at me for a long moment, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to amazement. "You're Marcus Thompson's sister." "Yes." "And you knew Detective Chen was investigating him when you introduced them?" "Yes." "How?" I'd taken a deep breath and told him everything. About my previous life, about Marcus's abuse and manipulation, about how he'd killed me and how I'd been reborn with the knowledge I needed to stop him. I'd described the months of planning, the careful manipulation of circumstances, the satisfaction of watching my abuser finally face consequences for his actions. James had listened without interruption, his FBI training allowing him to absorb complex information without judgment or emotional reaction. When I'd finished, he'd been quiet for several minutes, processing what I'd told him. "The rebirth thing is obviously impossible," he'd said finally, "but the rest of it makes perfect sense. You had insider knowledge of your brother's operation. You recognized Detective Chen from previous encounters, and you used that information to facilitate a successful investigation." I'd started to explain about my memories of dying and waking up in my younger body, but James had held up a hand. "Maya, I don't need you to convince me that you literally traveled back in time. What matters is that you had knowledge about your brother's criminal activities, and you used that knowledge to ensure he was arrested. Whether that knowledge came from past experience, careful observation, or intuitive deduction doesn't change the fact that you helped bring down a dangerous drug trafficker." His response had surprised me. "You're not bothered by the manipulation? By the fact that I deceived both you and Detective Chen about my motives? Are you kidding? You single-handedly solved one of the most challenging aspects of drug enforcement: how to gather evidence against family-based criminal organizations where traditional investigative techniques don't work. You found a way to turn the criminal's own emotional vulnerabilities against him while protecting the undercover officer and ensuring a successful prosecution." James had reached across the table and taken my hand. "Maya, what you did was brilliant. It was also dangerous and ethically complex, but it was absolutely necessary. Your brother was a predator who used family relationships to exploit and control people. You found the only way to stop him permanently while protecting yourself and his potential future victims." The relief I'd felt at his acceptance had been overwhelming. I'd carried the secret of my revenge for 5 years, and having James not only understand but approve of my actions had validated everything I'd sacrificed to achieve justice. "There's one more thing," I'd said. "I hired Detective Chen a few years ago to make sure she was okay after the case. I was worried that my manipulation might have caused her psychological harm. And she seemed fine. She left police work and started her own investigation firm, but she appeared to be successful and stable. I don't think I caused lasting damage." James had nodded approvingly. "That shows remarkable ethical consideration for someone you used as a tool in your revenge plan. A lot of people wouldn't have cared about the collateral damage." We'd talked for hours that night, with James asking detailed questions about my planning process and my decision-making at each stage of the operation. His professional interest in criminal psychology had made him fascinated by the strategic thinking I'd used to outmaneuver Marcus. "You realize you could probably have a career in law enforcement yourself," he'd said at one point. "Your ability to analyze criminal behavior and manipulate complex social situations is exactly what we need for undercover operations and criminal profiling." I'd laughed at the suggestion. "I think I'll stick to treating addiction. One foray into criminal justice was enough for me." But James's comment had made me think about the skills I'd developed and how I could use them constructively. I'd spent years studying Marcus's psychology, learning to predict his behavior, and finding ways to influence his decisions. Those same skills could be valuable in other contexts: understanding how addictive behaviors developed, predicting which treatment approaches would be most effective for individual patients, designing intervention programs that could change harmful patterns of behavior. I'd realized that my experience with Marcus had given me insights into human psychology that could help me be a more effective researcher and clinician. 10 years after Marcus's arrest, I'd been promoted to director of the National Institute's Addiction Treatment Research Division. My work had contributed to significant advances in understanding how trauma and family dynamics contributed to substance abuse, research that had led to new therapeutic approaches for treating addiction in people with histories of abuse and manipulation. James had become one of the FBI's leading experts on family-based criminal organizations, and his insights had helped law enforcement agencies develop new strategies for investigating and prosecuting crimes that involved complex family dynamics. He'd published research on how criminal families used emotional manipulation and abuse to control their members, work that had helped prosecutors understand the psychological factors that prevented victims from cooperating with law enforcement. We'd bought a house in the suburbs and had been trying to start a family of our own. The process had made me think seriously about the kind of parent I wanted to be and how to ensure that our children never experienced the kind of manipulation and abuse I'd endured with Marcus. I'd also been in contact with some of Marcus's other victims, people who'd reached out to me after learning about my role in his arrest. David, my former boyfriend whose life Marcus had destroyed, had become a close friend. He'd gone back to school after his conviction was overturned and was now working as a chemistry teacher, helping high school students discover their passion for science. Julia, my former lab partner, had completed her medical degree and was working as an addiction specialist. She'd credited our conversations about her experience with Marcus with helping her understand how manipulation and emotional abuse contributed to addictive behaviors. Several other people had shared similar stories about how Marcus had identified their vulnerabilities and exploited them for his own benefit. Each conversation had reinforced my belief that stopping Marcus had been necessary not just for my own survival, but for the protection of countless people who would have become his future victims. The most surprising contact had come from Sarah Chen herself. She'd called me at my office on a Tuesday afternoon, introducing herself as the detective who'd investigated my brother's case, and asking if we could meet to discuss some questions I have about the investigation. I'd agreed immediately, curious about what she wanted to discuss after so many years. We'd met at the same Vietnamese restaurant where I'd first observed her eating lunch, a choice that had felt appropriately symbolic. Sarah had looked older but confident, her manner professional but warmer than I remembered from our brief interaction years ago when I'd hired her investigative firm. "I've been thinking about your brother's case for years," she'd said after we'd ordered our food. "There were aspects of the investigation that never made complete sense to me. Such as the timing, the way everything fell into place so perfectly. The fact that you were so helpful in facilitating my relationship with Marcus, but you seem to have no knowledge of his criminal activities." Sarah had paused, studying my face carefully. "I think you knew exactly who I was from the beginning." I'd considered denying it, but had realized there was no point. Sarah had been an excellent detective, and she'd had years to analyze what had happened. More importantly, I'd respected her too much to insult her intelligence with an obvious lie. Yes, I knew. How? I'd given her the same explanation I'd given James, that I'd had inside knowledge of Marcus's operation and had recognized her as the detective assigned to investigate him. I'd described my history of abuse and Marcus's escalating criminal behavior, explaining how I'd realized that traditional law enforcement approaches wouldn't be effective against someone who used family relationships as protective cover. Sarah had listened intently, asking occasional questions, but mostly allowing me to tell my story completely. When I'd finished, she'd been quiet for several minutes. "I need you to know that what you did was incredibly dangerous," she'd said finally. "If Marcus had discovered that you were working against him, or if my cover had been blown before we had enough evidence to arrest him, both of us could have been killed. I know. I spent months planning every detail to minimize those risks. But you couldn't control every variable. There were dozens of ways the plan could have gone wrong, and most of them would have resulted in serious harm to innocent people." I'd nodded, accepting her criticism. "You're right. I was operating on incomplete information about how undercover investigations work, and I made decisions that could have endangered you and your team. I'm sorry about that." "I'm not looking for an apology," Sarah had said. "I'm trying to understand your decision-making process. From a law enforcement perspective, what you did was remarkable. You identified a criminal that traditional investigative techniques couldn't touch. You developed a strategy for gathering evidence that didn't rely on victim cooperation or witness testimony. And you executed a plan that resulted in the arrest and conviction of an entire criminal organization." She'd paused, choosing her words carefully. "The question is whether those results justify the methods you used." "What do you think?" I'd asked. "Honestly, I think you did what you had to do to stop someone who was destroying people's lives. Your brother was a predator who used his charm and family relationships to manipulate and control his victims. Traditional law enforcement relies on victims being willing and able to cooperate with investigations, but Marcus had made sure that was impossible. Sarah had leaned forward, her expression intense. The only way to stop him was from the inside, using someone he trusted completely. You were the only person in a position to do that. I'd felt a wave of relief at her words. Sarah's approval mattered to me because she was the person who'd been most directly affected by my manipulation. If she could understand and forgive my actions, then perhaps I could finally forgive myself for the methods I'd used to achieve justice. There's something else, Sarah had continued. The Marcus investigation wasn't the only case where I suspected family members were working against the criminals we were targeting. After your brother's arrest, I started paying more attention to the family dynamics in other cases, and I noticed patterns that suggested some family members were actively facilitating law enforcement efforts. What kind of patterns? Timing, mostly. Suspects making crucial mistakes right after family visits or phone calls. Evidence being left in places where it would be easily discovered. Criminals trusting the wrong people at exactly the wrong times. Sarah had smiled slightly. I think there are more people like you out there. Family members who've decided to stop protecting criminals and start protecting their communities instead. The difference is that most of them aren't as sophisticated or strategic as you were. The conversation had continued for another hour, with Sarah sharing insights about how family-based criminal organizations functioned and how law enforcement could better support family members who wanted to escape or seek justice. She'd suggested that we collaborate on research about the intersection between family abuse and criminal behavior, work that could help both law enforcement agencies and treatment providers understand these complex dynamics. I'd agreed immediately, recognizing that such research could be valuable for both of our professional goals and could help other people in situations similar to what I'd experienced with Marcus. 15 years after Marcus's conviction, our collaborative research had resulted in the publication of a groundbreaking study on family-based criminal organizations and the role of abuse in sustaining criminal behavior. The research had been adopted by law enforcement agencies across the country as a training resource for investigators working on cases involving family-based crimes. James and I had 2 children, a daughter named Emma, who was 8 years old, and a son named Daniel, who was 5. Both children were thriving in school and showed early signs of inheriting their parents' analytical minds and ethical instincts. I'd been careful to raise them with clear boundaries, consistent expectations, and respect for their individual personalities and interests. I'd wanted to make sure they never experienced the kind of manipulation and favoritism that had characterized my own childhood, and I'd worked hard to create a family environment based on honesty, support, and genuine care for each other's well-being. Emma had recently asked me about my family history, curious about why she only had one set of grandparents and no aunts or uncles from my side of the family. I'd explained that I'd had a brother who'd made some very bad choices and was no longer part of our lives, but that someday when she was older, I'd tell her the full story. I'd realized that my children would need to understand what had happened with Marcus, both as a cautionary tale about the importance of ethical behavior and as an explanation for why their mother had devoted her career to treating addiction and studying criminal psychology. But I'd wanted to wait until they were mature enough to understand the complexities of the situation and the moral ambiguities involved in seeking justice through deception. Marcus himself had been a model prisoner for most of his sentence, participating in educational programs and avoiding disciplinary problems. According to reports from the federal prison system, he'd earned his GED and had been working toward a bachelor's degree in business administration. He'd also been attending substance abuse counseling and anger management classes, though I'd been skeptical about whether he was genuinely committed to change or simply trying to improve his chances for early release. The question of whether Marcus had learned from his experience had become relevant recently because his parole hearing was scheduled for the following year. After serving 16 years of his 30-year sentence, he would be eligible for supervised release if the parole board determined that he no longer posed a threat to public safety. I'd been asked to provide a victim impact statement for his parole hearing, and I'd spent months considering what I wanted to say. On one hand, Marcus had never acknowledged the full extent of his abuse or taken responsibility for the harm he'd caused to me and his other victims. On the other hand, he'd served his time and had apparently participated in rehabilitative programs that might have genuinely changed his behavior. The decision had become more complicated when Marcus's lawyer had reached out to me directly, asking if I would be willing to support his client's application for parole. According to the lawyer, Marcus had expressed remorse for his past actions and was committed to rebuilding his relationship with his family members, particularly his sister, who he missed terribly, and hoped to reconcile with after his release. I declined the meeting, but the lawyer's message had forced me to think seriously about whether I was prepared to have Marcus back in the world, and whether his presence would pose any threat to my family or my peace of mind. James had been adamant that Marcus should serve his full sentence. He's a manipulative predator who used his own family members as tools for his criminal enterprise, James had argued. The fact that he's been well-behaved in prison doesn't erase the years of psychological abuse he inflicted on you, or the fact that he literally poisoned you to death in your previous life. I'd appreciated James's protective instincts, but I'd also recognized that my perspective on Marcus's punishment had evolved over the years. My initial desire for revenge had been satisfied by his arrest and conviction. My need for safety had been met by his imprisonment. What remained was the question of whether keeping him incarcerated served any meaningful purpose beyond punishment. Dr. Martinez, who I still saw occasionally for maintenance therapy sessions, had helped me think through the ethical implications of the parole decision. Your opinion about Marcus's parole eligibility is just one factor that the parole board will consider, she'd reminded me. They'll evaluate his behavior in prison, his participation in rehabilitation programs, his plans for reintegration into society, and his likelihood of reoffending. Your role is simply to provide information about the impact his crimes had on you as a victim. But what if he gets released and tries to contact me or my children? I'd asked. That's a separate issue that can be addressed through restraining orders and other legal protections. The question for the parole hearing is whether Marcus has been sufficiently rehabilitated to safely return to society, not whether his return would be convenient or comfortable for you. Dr. Martinez had been right, of course. The parole system existed to provide opportunities for rehabilitation and reintegration, not to ensure that victims never had to think about their abusers again. If Marcus had genuinely changed during his imprisonment and no longer posed a threat to public safety, then keeping him incarcerated would serve no purpose beyond satisfying my desire to see him continue suffering. I'd realized that my ability to forgive Marcus, or at least to stop actively wishing for his continued punishment, might be an important step in my own healing process. I'd decided to write a balanced victim impact statement that acknowledged the harm Marcus had caused while also recognizing his efforts at rehabilitation. I'd described the abuse I'd experienced, the impact it had had on my life and relationships, and the ongoing effects of his criminal behavior on our family and community. But I'd also noted that he'd served 16 years of his sentence responsibly and had apparently taken advantage of educational and therapeutic opportunities during his incarceration. I'd concluded the statement by saying that while I couldn't support Marcus's early release, I also wouldn't oppose it if the parole board determined that he'd been sufficiently rehabilitated. I'd requested that any parole agreement include provisions preventing him from contacting me or my family members without prior approval. But I'd acknowledged that such restrictions should be based on public safety considerations, rather than personal preference. The parole hearing had been scheduled for the following month, and I'd been preparing myself emotionally for the possibility that Marcus might be released within the next year. Marcus's parole hearing had taken place on a cold morning in February, 15 years to the day after his original arrest. I'd chosen not to attend in person, but I'd submitted my written statement and had been available by phone to answer questions from the parole board. The hearing had lasted most of the day, with testimony from prison officials, social workers, psychologists, and other experts who'd worked with Marcus during his incarceration. According to the reports I'd received afterward, Marcus had presented himself as a reformed man who'd taken full responsibility for his crimes and was committed to making amends for the harm he'd caused. He'd described his participation in educational programs, his work as a tutor for other inmates, and his plans for finding employment and housing after release. He'd expressed remorse for his past actions and had outlined specific steps he'd taken to understand and address the psychological factors that had contributed to his criminal behavior. Most importantly, he'd acknowledged the abuse he'd inflicted on family members and had committed to maintaining no contact with his victims unless they specifically requested communication. The parole board had been impressed by his presentation and his apparent commitment to rehabilitation, but they'd also expressed concern about his history of manipulation and his ability to present a convincing facade while concealing his true intentions. After deliberating for several hours, they'd granted him parole with strict conditions. He would be required to live in a halfway house for the first year of his release, maintain steady employment, attend regular counseling sessions, and avoid any contact with family members or former associates from his criminal organization. He would also be subject to regular drug testing, electronic monitoring, and surprise visits from his parole officer. Marcus would be released in 6 months, after completing additional preparation programs designed to help long-term inmates readjust to life outside prison. I'd felt a mixture of anxiety and relief when I'd learned about the parole board's decision. On one hand, I'd been nervous about having Marcus back in the world, even under strict supervision. On the other hand, I'd been glad that the question of his punishment was finally resolved and that I could stop thinking about his incarceration as an ongoing concern. James had been less sanguine about the decision. 16 years isn't enough for what he did to you, he'd said when I'd told him about the parole board's ruling. And I don't trust that he's genuinely changed. Manipulative people don't stop being manipulative just because they've been in prison. Maybe not, I'd agreed, but that's not really my problem anymore. I stopped Marcus from continuing to hurt people, and he's paid the legal penalty for his crimes. What he does with the rest of his life is between him and his parole officer. The truth was that I'd felt surprisingly little about Marcus's impending release. The man who'd tormented me for most of my life, who'd killed me in my previous existence, who'd represented everything I'd feared and hated about my family, had become just another former criminal trying to rebuild his life after prison. The satisfaction of my revenge had faded years ago, replaced by a sense of completion and moving forward. I'd built a life I was proud of, with work that mattered and a family that loved and supported me. Marcus's presence or absence in the world no longer had the power to affect my happiness or peace of mind. I'd won. Not because Marcus was suffering in prison, but because I'd created a life free from his influence and had found ways to help other people escape similar situations. That felt like a much more meaningful victory than simple revenge ever could have been. 6 months later, Marcus had been released from federal prison and had moved into a halfway house in a city 3 states away from where I lived. I'd learned about his release from a brief notification from the Victim Services Office, but otherwise had heard nothing from or about him. I'd hoped that would continue indefinitely. 2 years after his release, I'd received a letter from Marcus that had been screened by his parole officer before being forwarded to me. In carefully constructed language that avoided any suggestion of threat or manipulation, Marcus had written to express his remorse for his past actions and his gratitude for the difficult lessons he'd learned as a result of his conviction and imprisonment. He'd described his current life. He was working as a janitor at a community college, living in a small apartment, and attending weekly therapy sessions. He'd made no friends among his criminal associates from his previous life, and he'd focused on building a simple, honest existence that caused no harm to others. He'd asked for nothing from me except the opportunity to apologize. He'd acknowledged that his abuse had been inexcusable, that his criminal behavior had harmed countless people, and that he bore full responsibility for the consequences of his actions. He'd expressed hope that I'd been able to build a happy life despite the trauma he'd caused, and he'd promised never to contact me again unless I specifically requested communication. The letter had been surprisingly moving. Marcus's writing had lacked the manipulative charm and self-serving justifications that had characterized his past behavior. Instead, he'd sounded like someone who genuinely grappled with the harm he'd caused and was working to become a better person. I'd shown the letter to James and Dr. Martinez, both of whom had been cautiously optimistic about its contents. "It sounds like genuine remorse," Dr. Martinez had said, "but the real test will be whether his behavior matches his words over the long term." James had been more skeptical. "It's well written and says all the right things, but Marcus has always been good at telling people what they want to hear. The question is whether this represents genuine change or just a more sophisticated form of manipulation." I'd decided not to respond to the letter, but I'd also realized that I felt no anger or fear when reading Marcus's words. The brother who'd terrorized me for decades had become just another person trying to make sense of his mistakes and build a better future. That transformation from monster to human being had felt like the final resolution of our long conflict. 3 years after Marcus's release, I'd been contacted by a journalist who was writing a book about family-based criminal organizations and their impact on victims. She'd interviewed several people who'd been harmed by relatives involved in organized crime, and she'd wanted to include my story as an example of how victims could seek justice when traditional law enforcement approaches weren't effective. I'd agreed to the interview, though I'd requested that my real name not be used, and that certain identifying details be changed to protect my privacy and safety. During our conversation, the journalist had asked whether I felt my actions had been justified given the methods I'd used and the risks I'd taken. I think I did what I had to do to stop someone who was harming people, I'd answered. Were there other approaches I could have tried? Probably. Would they have been as effective? I doubt it. Marcus was too smart and too manipulative for traditional law enforcement techniques to work against him. Do you have any regrets about how you handled the situation? And I'd thought about the question for several minutes before answering. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that Marcus chose to become the kind of person who needed to be stopped. I regret that our family dynamics were so toxic that I felt revenge was my only option for achieving safety and justice. But I don't regret stopping him. I don't regret the methods I used, and I don't regret the fact that he spent 16 years in prison paying for his crimes. The journalist had asked about Marcus's current status and whether I'd had any contact with him since his release. He wrote me a letter a few years ago, apologizing for his behavior. I didn't respond, but I was glad to see that he seemed to understand the harm he'd caused. Whether that understanding represents genuine change or just better manipulation skills, I don't know, but it's not really my concern anymore. Are you worried that he might try to seek revenge against you for orchestrating his arrest? I'd considered the question seriously. No, I'm not worried about that. Marcus is smart enough to understand that any attempt to harm me or my family would result in him going back to prison for the rest of his life. More importantly, I think his experience in the criminal justice system taught him that I'm not someone who can be easily intimidated or manipulated. If he learned anything during his 16 years in prison, it's that underestimating me was the biggest mistake of his criminal career. The journalist's book had been published 6 months later, with my story included as a chapter titled The Sister's Gambit. The book had received positive reviews and had been used as a training resource by law enforcement agencies and victim advocacy organizations. Reading about my experience in published form had been strange but cathartic. Seeing my story presented alongside similar cases had helped me understand that my situation with Marcus hadn't been unique, and that the methods I'd used could potentially help other people in comparable situations. Several readers had reached out to me through the publisher, sharing their own experiences with abusive family members involved in criminal activities. Their stories had reinforced my belief that traditional approaches to domestic violence and family-based crime often failed to protect victims who were trapped by complicated relationships with their abusers. I'd started volunteering with an organization that helped family members of criminals navigate the complex process of cooperating with law enforcement while protecting their own safety and well-being. The work had allowed me to use my experience with Marcus constructively while helping other people achieve justice and freedom from abusive family dynamics. 20 years after Marcus's arrest, I'd received news that he'd died of a heart attack at the age of 57. He'd been working as a maintenance supervisor at the community college, where he'd started as a janitor, and according to his obituary, he'd been well regarded by his colleagues and had lived quietly without incident for the 8 years since his release from prison. His death had marked the definitive end of a chapter in my life that had defined me for decades. I'd felt neither sadness nor relief at the news, just a sense of closure and the knowledge that Marcus would never again have the opportunity to harm me or anyone else. I'd attended his funeral, not out of grief or forgiveness, but out of a need to witness the final resolution of our conflict. The service had been small, attended mostly by people from his work and his halfway house. Our parents had died several years earlier, and I'd been his only surviving family member. I'd sat in the back of the chapel, watching as Marcus's colleagues had shared memories of a quiet, helpful man who'd been generous with his time and supportive of his coworkers. They described someone who'd seemed to carry a deep sadness but who'd never let it interfere with his commitment to honest work and kind treatment of others. The person they described had been nothing like the Marcus I'd known, and I'd found myself wondering if his imprisonment had genuinely changed him, or if he'd simply become more skilled at hiding his true nature. I'd realized that I would never know the answer to that question, and that it didn't matter. What mattered was that I'd survived his abuse, stopped his criminal behavior, and built a life defined by my own choices rather than his manipulation. Whether Marcus had died as a reformed man or a well-concealed predator was irrelevant to my success in escaping his influence and creating something meaningful from my experience. As I'd watched his casket being lowered into the grounds, I'd felt a profound sense of peace. The brother who'd tormented me, killed me, and shaped my understanding of power and manipulation was finally gone. The woman who'd outmaneuvered him, orchestrated his downfall, and used her victory as a foundation for helping others had survived and thrived. In the end, that was the only justice that really mattered. Not Marcus's punishment or suffering, but my ability to transform his abuse into something that made the world a little bit better for people who'd faced similar challenges. I'd left the cemetery that day knowing that I'd finally completely won. The story of Marcus and Maya Thompson had ended, but the work of understanding and preventing family-based criminal abuse would continue. And that continuation, that commitment to turning personal trauma into broader social good, felt like the most satisfying revenge of all. Standing in my office 25 years after Marcus's arrest, surrounded by awards recognizing my contributions to addiction research and criminal justice reform, I'd reflected on the long journey from victim to survivor to advocate. The scared young woman who died from her brother's poison had become a respected scientist whose work had helped thousands of people escape addiction and abuse. My children, now adults with families of their own, had grown up understanding that their mother's career had been motivated by a desire to prevent other people from experiencing the kind of harm that Marcus had inflicted. They'd learned about courage, justice, and the importance of using privilege and knowledge to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Emma had become a prosecutor specializing in domestic violence cases, inspired by her understanding of how family dynamics could enable and sustain criminal behavior. Daniel had chosen to work in addiction medicine, following his mother's path of treating the medical consequences of criminal enterprises like the one his uncle had operated. Both of them had understood, without needing explicit explanation, that their family's commitment to justice and healing had been born from experience with injustice and harm. James and I had recently celebrated our 20th wedding anniversary, marking 2 decades of partnership built on honesty, mutual respect, and shared commitment to using our professional skills to make the world safer and more just. Our marriage had been strengthened by my decision to trust him with the truth about Marcus, and our work had been enhanced by our combined expertise in criminal psychology and addiction treatment. Sarah Chen and I had maintained a professional relationship that had evolved into genuine friendship. Our collaborative research had influenced law enforcement training across the country, and our joint presentations at conferences had helped investigators better understand the psychology of family-based criminal organizations. She'd never expressed any resentment about my manipulation of her investigation, instead, viewing our collaboration as an example of how victims and law enforcement could work together to achieve justice in cases where traditional approaches were insufficient. The research program I'd built had trained dozens of graduate students who'd gone on to careers in addiction treatment, criminal justice, and victim advocacy. Many of them had told me that their work had been motivated by the understanding that academic research could be a powerful tool for social change and individual healing. Looking back on the complex journey from Marcus's abuse to his arrest to his death, I'd recognized that every phase had contributed to my understanding of power, manipulation, and the possibility of redemption. The skills I'd developed to survive and outsmart Marcus had made me a better researcher, teacher, and advocate. The patience I'd learned while planning his downfall had served me well in conducting long-term studies and building institutional change. The strategic thinking I'd used to manipulate his relationship with Sarah had helped me navigate academic politics and policy development. The emotional resilience I'd cultivated to survive his abuse had allowed me to work with traumatized patients and survivors without becoming overwhelmed by their pain. Even the satisfaction I'd felt in orchestrating Marcus's destruction had taught me important lessons about the psychology of revenge and the difference between justice and vengeance. Understanding my own capacity for manipulation and strategic deception had made me more aware of those dynamics in my research subjects and more effective at helping them recognize and resist manipulation by others. In the most fundamental sense, my experience with Marcus had given me both the motivation and the tools to spend my life fighting the kind of harm he'd represented. And that transformation, from victim to victor to healer, had been the most complete and satisfying revenge imaginable. The young woman who'd died choking on her brother's poison had been reborn not just with a second chance at life, but with the knowledge, skills, and determination needed to ensure that Marcus Thompson's legacy would be defined not by the harm he'd caused, but by the healing work his abuse had inspired. That seemed like perfect justice to me.